We begin our third lecture from the fourth module. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the different class system, caste-wise sections and segmentations that caused a definite change in the augmentation of the images as far as their art practice were concerned in Madhubani. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on a different aspect which is connected at the same time, slightly separated with from that context. Uh, the reason is that while we spoke about the class-wise divisions that gave birth to many different distinctive and prominent styles in the tradition, this is also true that those barriers are removed to a large extent in today's context, and there are painters who are practicing the style of Madhubani painting freely with lots of creative freedom. And that is one reason why they're not restricted to a particular community. There are painters who do not even belong to the family of the Madhubani painters, but they've taken up this art form as the regular mode of expression. So there's a change in the quality of living and the quality of creation, and that is also quite significant in that context. This is also true that when it got shifted from its traditional cultural happening, earlier it was a tradition that only the women of the families would paint the pictures, and the male members, especially a young male, they used to help them out to some extent, but they were mostly engaged into agricultural practices. But when the male members of the community they took up art as a tradition, the things have changed. And now when we visit the galleries and art exhibitions, we see that there's a free flow of creative interests, regardless of the identities of those people, whether which community they belong to, which caste they belong to, and which is very positive, whether the male or female. So it has got a very different image altogether. So I'll show a few images to you just to give you some idea of how it is and also speak about it. So with the introduction of paper as a medium, a small but growing number of men from the community have taken up painting as their profession. Some male artists from the family of tantric priests paint avatars of Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. They paint yantras, the transcendent tantric pattern corresponding to those figures. They paint images from Ramayana, Mahabharata, Harishchandra, Shakuntala, alongside the current topics like the chronicle of a murder in the village that indicates its responsiveness to the social issues, which is more urban. Seen in the picture is a gallery space where the artists of Madhubani are displaying their pictures together in a flow. Krishnanand Jha, a tantric kalakar of 1980s, worked on the complex geometrical formations of yantra. He continues to work on the mythological episodes also, and alongside the mythological subject matters, he is concentrated on the most current topics as a reaction to what is happening around him, which is very secular, contemporary, and modern as expression. At the same time, he is strictly adhering to some of the traditional style of execution that is very typical of Madhubani. So it's very easy to identify his work uh, as Madhubani painting, and there's no other scope that you can call it any other thing but a Madhubani painting. Though the subject matters are radical and very, very leaving uh, and timely. Gopal Saha worked on the local scenes in a perplexed, humorous style. He used a lot of sarcastic images, humors, caricatures, but he followed the style of Madhubani very authentically. Dushad artist Sarup Lal Paswan began painting images from the adventures of their cultural hero Raja Salhesh. Raja Salhesh is a local hero from the border of Nepal, and he's the one who had a forbidden garden that he owned. Raja Salhesh was blessed with his beloved brother Motiram, and both these characters they rode on a horse and an elephant respectively, and they are the owner of a beautiful enchanted garden where they had the malins or the gardeners throughout, and there are parrots called Hira Sugavan who sings beautiful songs. So it gives us the picture of a perfect utopian condition where everything is perfect and beautiful and prosperous. So these are the factors that are seen in their creations, and of course the artwork where King Salhesh and the related characters are involved, they are far beyond the normal academic representational styles that went parallel to it. So there are also other painters which are like the male painters who are very they worth a mentioning, like Santosh Kumar Das, a habitat of Ranti, a village which is there are two main villages in Madhubani called Jitwarpur and Rati. So he belongs to the place called Rati in Madhubani in the Mithila region in North Bihar, and he studied painting at the MS University Baroda. So he went under the mainstream academic education, but then he explored Madhubani painting to express a wide range of subjects of his choice. This effort stands quite significant, adding a new dimension to move the tradition furthermore. He was appointed as the director and primary instructor at the Mithila Art Institute, Madhubani in 2004. In the newer generation artists, a very talented and creative person who is still very young, his name is Ram Bharoz Jha, who has also involved himself with lots of illustration projects for the eminent publishers. He is illustrating pictures in those books along with his self expression, where he is coming up with highly creative and original expression following the style of painting from Madhubani. So his experimentation and free thinking made some mark in the tradition. To observe, the men practicing Madhubani style of painting have a freer choice of subject matters as compared to the painters, which are who are women. For the women painters, they are still continuing with some religious subject matters, and many of them who are slightly younger, they are still practicing some images which are highly radical, and there are feminist themes that are also coming to the pictures, and we are going to see and discuss all those things in the following lectures in greater detail. So the male members of the community joined the profession only after the introduction of paper, as we mentioned. The men stay away from painting the walls and indulging in floor paintings and other rituals. So for them, that's not a compulsion, and they never did it traditionally. and Kober, or the cosmological icons, or the Aripans. So those are the traditional decorative forms that was very popular in Madhubani. They no longer stick to those things, but of course the women member, they're still continuing with that. But many of the male members are experimenting with the traditional cover motif by picking up the essential decoration of it and rendering it in a uh, different direction. So the Kober cosmological icons and Aripan, so the floor and wall decorations, they're also in the scene with a different rendition. Men work on secular subjects and also the political issues. They respond and express their reactions to the current happenings to a large extent. So they also have folk tales, moral stories, and other literary resources to include in their subject matters. Nevertheless, their paintings have strictly adhered to the traditional style and identity and blend suitably in the uh, general continuum of Mithila painting tradition, being initially a feminine preserve. Although the new generation women painters are also showing inclination towards a similar choice of subject to the men were innovative since the beginning and have contributed uh, commonly to the rapid growth to uplift the tradition and bring it to a different direction. There's one factor that we cannot completely deny, that when the men painters, they realized the um, monetary factor, that this particular painting tradition is able to generate more monetary sources, they got drawn into it in the beginning. They felt that this is a great source of income and this is much more profitable than the agricultural practices. So many of them, they have completely moved from the agrarian professions and they're into making paintings, and they're training themselves in that style, just keeping the prospects in mind. While about 10 women have received state or national awards over time, the village based male painters seem to have been precluded from this honor. Ironically, two male Mithila painters recently received national award, but both are based in New Delhi. But then it is certainly the women of Madhubani who solely held the tradition for years, seamlessly and for no material benefit in mind. They deserve the credit to maintain the simplicity of their beautiful minds, to stick to their faith despite the apparent difficulty and hardship of their daily livelihood. So the rewards are well deserved. According to David Santon, Ram Bharos is very creative. Ram Bharos Jha is one of the uh, most talented male painter in Madhubani in today's time, who is constantly into experiments. Recently, he worked on collages by cutting his own paintings into different areas to create a surrealistic image. The painting that is shown at the background has images which are very new, and the researchers are extremely excited about the innovative initiatives by the traditional painters of new generation, who is providing the practice with a new profile. In this painting by Ram Bharos Jha, what we see is that he painted two pictures, and then by combining two different pictures, he has created a dreamlike space which is a underwater scene. that has a surrealistic approach towards it. So it's a difficult and complex juxtaposition of different forms that are traditionally found in Madhubani painting, but the arrangement is unique and free. And it's also very encouraging to see how the pictorial elements are being experimented by these painters. The entire picture has thin and intricate linear pattern into it that has an extremely decorative possibility. At the same time, the painting is so expressionistic and surreal in its character that it hardly looks decorative in our eyes. Ram Bharoz Jha with his contemporary paintings in an exhibition space. There are a few very important things that needs to be realized by us when we look at Indian folk and minor painting into the academic limelight. We see that if we take things in that perspective, it gives us a notion that it's in a constant mode of change, and it's our duty again to assess whether the change has to be taken in the right spirit or should be prevented. The reason I'm making all these points are that there are cases where there are comments like when the it has been a feminine preserve for so many years, so what is the need to include the male painters into the practice who is contaminating the practice to some extent. They're bringing new subject matters which is killing the traditional aesthetics, and it's putting us away from the pleasure of the painting. So these are some comments made by people who are not well informed, and they are also ignorant about the basic ideologies of cultural growth that is like that should be appreciated by the community when there's a change that is taking place. And this is perhaps the mode of survival or that is enjoyed by a traditional culture. So the culture sustains and survives with the change that takes place here. And when we feel that it's not changing over a long period of time, then it is indicative of its physical death, and it also kills its soul to a complete extent. So this is also true for the traditional culture. For example, when we look at Egyptian painting that remained unchanged for years because of the strict norms, because of the rules, the canons that were imposed on the community, they could not change. It just happened for a short duration. If we make a comparative study with the traditional culture, the traditional culture that enjoyed royal patronage, we see a complete different scene, that they're highly stylized. They also didn't stick to the representational norms. But it's also true that there had been a small period when a king like Akhenaten who takes over, and he was slightly liberal. For Akhenaten's influence caused some change to take place in the tradition, and immediately after him Tutankhamun took over. And with Tutankhamun, it was also very evident that he wanted to go back to the earlier tradition, and he just felt that everything is almost over. So it's time to revive the old tradition. They again went back, and the tradition remained very rigid, although it's very rich, but it's very rigid and conservative in that form. And in a way, when we look at the painting tradition in our country, and for example, we used Madhubani as the feminine preserve, and then it moved towards another practice that is dominated by the male painters in today's time. It's very interesting to see that it never enjoyed a patronage of any sort. They're just surviving on their own, and this is also a great matter of pride that with such minimum patronage it could survive and come along uh, a very long way because of its initial virtue of its rich aesthetics, the cultural uh, connection that they made with the from the thematic aspect of those paintings, and also because of a rich tradition that was responsible for it. So the new face, the new profile of Madhubani painting must be very different, but it's also a great matter of concern that we should also see that the huge popularity for such a tradition should not make it repetitive. So if people are over conscious about what should be the flow of history, that can also make it highly stagnant. To make it very simple, we know that when we look at the commercial viability of a particular image making, it no longer remains a artistic creation. It becomes a product, and then it may also lead to a stage where it is treated as a commodity. So, making anything in visual style that is folk or minor in their visual characteristic doesn't make it a successful piece of folk art. It should have the right soul and expression in it to convey the idea, and that way the tradition can go long with utter strength and dignity. And that is our aim. So, we need to also develop a finer eye, and we should be well informed to realize that and then look at it from a right perspective.